We got through the first 3 or 4 verses last week. We've been in this time where obviously Israel is struggling spiritually. They've had somewhat of a revival in chapter 7, but seemingly that ends because in chapter 8 you'll see. In verse 4, the elders of Israel come to Ramah and they tell Samuel, "You're old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king." Listen to their request. And it's easy, as you study this or as you talk about this, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4, it's easy to get hard on them, and we will be hard on them tonight, I guess. But we all struggle with this idea of God being in control of everything. We all struggle with trying to make our own decisions, trying to do it our way, etc., right? But listen to their request. It's kind of crazy. So they've been led by God, and God's done a pretty good job, right? He got them out of Egypt. He's led them this far. It's not like God had let them down ever. And yet, people have let them down, and there's been injustices, and they've been accepted. But let's be clear about something too. In order for Samuel's sons to accept bribes, it means people are what? Yeah, people are offering them. So maybe if you have a more spiritual people, then this doesn't happen. Because if no one wants to pay a bribe, then no one can be bribed. But there's got this whole mess. And listen to the words, "Give us a king." Man, that's a slide against God. Give us a king. Like you're joking, right? You've had a king. You've had God the whole time. Give us a king to judge us. Now think about this from a purely human point of view. If you're not where you need to be, if you want to dictate things, if you want to get around a system, if you don't want to do exactly what the Lord wants you to do, you can see why they don't want God to be their judge. I mean, the bad part is that other judges are not just like God. The upside might be, not really the upside, but in that messed up way of thinking is that they don't know everything and they can't hold me account like God can. And so think about what they're saying. We want a king to judge us like all the other nations have. When you read that, you see the absolute nonsense. Not only are you trying to swap God, and by the way, whilst he gives them a king, we'll see. You know who's still king? God has his hand over. Like, it's funny to me because they think they're picking Saul. But guess who picks him? And then when God's done with Saul, guess who gets the next pick? So whilst they think they've traded kings, God allows them to have a king, but he has his hand what? All over it. Because if he didn't, where would Israel go? So even when we try to get out of God being king, guess what? He's still king. He's still king. It's not like he's like, oh, you... And if he ever did say, I won't interfere at all, you do it, then it won't be long before you're on your knees crying mercy. They're asking for a king, but look at what he says. This is maybe the more subtle bit. Like all the other what? This is the trap of modern day church. This is a trap in Israel. Israel was absolutely 1,000% to be different. Everything, from their festivals to how they dressed, to how the tabernacle, to everything about them was peculiar. Everything about them was different because they were showcasing who? They weren't meant to be like any other people. They were never called to be like the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Jebusites. God had his hand on them, and he wanted them to be different because their difference showed them who God was. And now the subtlety of the devil is we want other kings to judge us so we can be like every other what? And see, that's a problem. Either the world is going to change the church or the church is going to change the world. Like either the church is going to go the direction we need to be more like them, or the world is going to see it and say we need to be more like them. Something's going to give. And even in modern day like church growth and modern day philosophies, you can see how we're trying to adopt and not be so peculiar, not be so kind of, picked out. We want to blend in. The moment you want to blend in with culture, you've lost the fight. Israel said, we want to be like every other nation. Well, okay, if Israel is like every other nation, what do they have? The whole power, the whole glory, the whole thing. Israel has God. Israel has this chance to worship him, to do. Everything was a forerunner. Everything had a purpose. Everything, worshiping God, honoring God, all of these, everything was like to the nth degree, like even camping in a cross shape. I mean, God had it all down to a science, to perfection. And they say, we want to be like every other nation. Has someone ever said something to you that cut you to the heart a little bit? This is why, you see, thank God for God's grace and God's mercy, because this is pretty rank. And here's part of the problem. Here's the cultural problem. Look at verse 6. Who does it say was displeased? Okay, that's awesome. But what do you not read? Think about it. What do you not read? Samuel and what? Anybody, well, no, but anybody else. Like, there's one person display. They all to a T come and say, we don't want God. And it appears that Samuel's the only one that says, this isn't a great idea. Like, and we get caught in that, right? We get caught in, well, if no one, like, I don't want to cause a fuss. I don't want to support the minority. I don't want to be labeled crazy. Okay, they're talking to Samuel at the moment. But as this plan comes out, where are the people who say having a king not a good idea? You can't tell me that everybody thought this was a good idea. At the moment, they're just talking to Samuel, but the plan's going to come out. And you never read, but so-and-so stood up and said, Samuel's right. Samuel's the only one, it seems, that says, this is not a great idea. He is displeased. He's hurt. He doesn't get it. He's smart enough. He's wise enough. He's spiritual enough to understand what they're saying. And so, look what Samuel does. Samuel was displeased with their request. He's had a rough meeting, right? You ever had a rough day? Our flesh tends to what? To react, to respond, to fight, to manipulate, to go off and, like, if someone says something about you, your flesh says what? Say something back. Oh, you want to write me a rude email? Here you go. Text message. Oh, I'll just one-up you, right? Samuel is displeased. He's hacked off. He's spiritually, like, hurting. And it says he went to who? He went to the Lord for guidance. Okay, so these people who have come, the elders, have they gone to God for guidance? Clearly they haven't, because you know what the Holy Spirit didn't tell them? Replace God as your king. Right? They never went to meet with God and God said, hey, I don't want to be your king anymore. They hadn't been communicating with God. We do that sometimes, right? And then we come back and like, I messed this up. Yeah, I know you did. But I like Samuel's fact that he knew this was wrong. He knew, and he stood up, he stands up, and he's displeased. So he goes to the Lord for guidance. And then you got to wonder what he's thinking when God says this. He says, do everything they say to you. All of a sudden, you see what's funny about this? What's ironic about this? Samuel is declaring that God is king, right? Samuel believes that God should be in control, that God's pretty good at this, that we don't need a change. Like when God's president, let's just keep voting him in, right? So that's what his theory is. That's what his stance is going to be. And do you see how God challenges him on that? The last thing Samuel in his earthly mind wants to do is what? Do what they're saying. And yet God comes to him and says, do exactly what they're asking. So it's like Samuel in that moment is now challenged with, how much do I believe God is king? And how much do I believe God is right? Because the last thing I expected and the last thing I wanted to do is say, yeah, he probably left out like, well, you imagine the scene, and it doesn't go into all this detail, but you imagine after leaving the elders, he probably was like, well, that happened over my dead body. Like, we ain't doing that. That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And yet then he goes to God, and God says, Samuel, do what they're asking. You think that's not a challenge for Samuel? It's ironic, right? He's pushing kingship, and yet God in his own life is challenging him, Samuel. And look at what he says. For they, and God is gracious, God is good, and he says, for they're rejecting me, not what? What's he telling Samuel? Don't take this personally. Maybe Samuel looks at it and says, where did I go wrong with my kids? Where did I go wrong in and God says, hold on, Samuel, just step back a minute. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. This has been the whole misunderstanding of Israel from the beginning. When they came against Moses, what did Moses say? Moses was wise enough and savvy enough to understand the correlation. When they came against Moses, he didn't take it personally. He told them, you're not coming against me. You're coming against who? You're coming against God. Moses knew he wasn't king. Moses knew the plans weren't his. And so and we got to understand that. Look, the modern day version of that is when you come against the church, you're not coming against the pastor, the deacon, the person, whoever you're coming against God. And when you see that, it changes our behavior, it changes our reactions. And God says to Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. How much lower can Israel get? If Israel is rejecting God, where's the light in the world? And this is what we've been talking about. So Israel isn't much of a light. So you know what God has to do is everything himself, basically. I mean, how bad is it when the church, if the church rejects God, then who's going to? Look at what it says. For they're rejecting me, not you. They don't, and listen, God isn't like misunderstanding. God isn't being melodramatic. God knows every thought. God knows every heart. He says they don't want me to be their king any longer. That is the spiritual situation they find themselves in. They've come and they've masked it because they can't come and say we're going against God. So they do what everyone does. And all of us, we've got to get better. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. How many times are you in a conversation where the truth just isn't told? People say, I'm upset about that. That's got nothing to do with it. Them being upset by Samuel's kid is not the truth. That's not what they're upset about. In fact, some of them are probably gaining from them being crazy. They're not upset, but they can't stand in front of Samuel and say, we want to reject God as king. They can't. Sometimes we have feelings and emotions that you don't even be brave enough to speak. How many people would sit in church and say, I just want to come against God for a minute? Surely that would elicit a reaction. Surely someone would be like, I don't think so. Motion denied. But they can't say that. We can't say that. You see it all the time in my life. You see it in all of these things. Like if we could just, but lots of times we can't verbalize the truth. Why? Why can't, when someone says what's wrong, why do you shy away from telling them? Oh, we have all kind of worries about their feelings and all that, right? But at some level, we just don't want to admit what? Yeah. So we have to make up some nonsense. And so God says, oh, I'm sorry, your two sons have messed this up. Is that what he said? No. He said, they want to reject me as king. That's the issue. And look at what he says. Ever since, so this is not a new thing, ever since I brought them from Egypt. Think about God saying this. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually, what? Abandoned me, and followed other what? So it's not like God isn't patient. It's not like he hasn't been gracious. This has been a continuum. Ever since he got them out of Egypt. Remember, it starts so well. Deborah and the tambourine, and everything's going swell, and everything's fine. And yet the continuation is God saying to Samuel, this isn't our first rodeo. Like these people, they've been like this. This is what they are. They've abandoned me. They follow other gods. And now he says, and now they are giving you the same treatment. Think about that. God has put Samuel in as prophet, as judge. And they look at Samuel and they reject. And this is a badge of honor for Samuel. Why are they rejecting Samuel? Think about it. Why are they rejecting Samuel? This is the highest honor you'll ever have in your life. They're rejecting Samuel because he's representing God. He is so good with God, they hate him. They don't want him around. They don't want him anymore. They can fluff it. They can say it's your sons. They can give any excuse. But imagine being one of the only lights. And I don't know how many lights they had, but Samuel's one of the brightest ones. Like, imagine when you're the only one that sees that God should be king. That is why they're rejecting Samuel. That's why they don't want him to be prophet or judge anymore. Man, that's the highest. Listen, if people reject you because you're showing off too much of God, that's the greatest honor you'll ever have. And so, verse 9, again, he says, do as they ask. And now God kind of expands it a little and helps Samuel a little, and it's really cool what he does. Remember what he's told them. Anything, what they're saying, just go and what? Do it. In verse 9, he says the same thing. Do as they what? Do as they ask. But then he throws something at Samuel. And this is Christianity 101 in our lifetime. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. In other words, God is saying, yeah, they can do that. But before they do it, let's be clear on what's going to happen. You can do it. You can go your way. But isn't that what the Bible says? You can do what you want. You can go your way. But the Bible never minces words or hides what's going to happen. You can do what you want. You can go, you can do whatever. But there's going to come a time where you're going to regret what you've done. And God is very gracious. God is very merciful. He could have just kicked them all out. He could have just killed them. He's like, oh, you want a king? Go ahead, have a king. But he says, and now imagine this, and this is how bad it gets. How bitter and broken and distressed and defeated and discouraged do you need to be where you don't care the ramifications on you or your family? Think about that. When your behavior affects you and your family and you don't care, how far have you gone? I mean, if someone sat you down and said, do you see the destruction you've brought to your family? Do you see the spiritual problems you have? I don't care. What God is going to explain is this is what's going to happen to your kids. This is what he's going to tell them. You can go this route, but I promise you, this is what's going to happen to you, this is what's going to happen to your stuff, and this is what's going to happen to your kids. Imagine God says that's going to affect your kids, and you're like, so what? You think you might need a parenting class? I mean, what would your kids do if they heard that? If God said, don't do that, it's bad for your kids. I don't care. And God says, okay, they can do it. They can have a king. Because God's going to have control anyway. But he warns them. And look at what it says. Just imagine this situation. Verse 10. So Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking for a king. All right, here you go, guys. This is what God said. This is how a king will reign over you, Samuel said. The king, what will he first do? He will draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers, making them what? Do you see what he's saying? You've just put your son in grave what? Who runs in front of the chariot? And you know who you're taking the spear for? You're taking it. So hold on. I'm willing to take a spear for Saul, but I won't stand for God. My son was fine. My son wasn't conscripted. Yes, God used him and God fought, but Israel was always all right when they obeyed God. All of a sudden now, God, imagine your kid, like, why am I running in front of a chariot? Well, we voted on that. What does anyone say when the dude gets killed? Like, how do you stand at your son's funeral and think, oh, well, You literally put him in that position because you wanted a king. And he tells them, look, he will draft your sons. And by the way, there's going to come a day where the knock comes and like, we're drafting your son. You know what you can't do? Yeah. There's no crying then. Well, this has never happened before. Yeah, you changed kings. Remember that? Look at what it says. Make them run before the chariots. Verse 12. Some will be generals. Some will be captains in his army. Well, that sounds glamorous until you realize who's going to lead it. Some will be forced. Listen to this. Some will be forced to plow in his fields and harvest his crops. In other words, when the king says get to work, guess what you have to do? And if you don't like it, guess what? And do you notice how many times the word these verses say his? You realize, right, this is just what the king gets. Well, hold on. If you're paying off the king, are you done? So not only now do you have to give to God, because that's always required. Now you have to also give to who? It's not a very great system, is it? Before I was giving to one king. Now I got to give to, I had a perfect king, and now, look at what it says. So you'll be forced to plow in his fields and harvest his fields, his crops. And some will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king, here we go. Oh, well, at least it's not my daughter. Wrong. Just put yourself in as a parent. The king will take your daughters from you. You imagine showing up at the house. We're going to take your daughter. What? Yeah. Why? Saul wants her. Huh. And God is basically telling them, what? Before you make this ridiculous mistake, here's what I'm telling you. God does the same thing to us. Let's be honest. You ever been warned by God and done it anyway and then realized you should have taken a warning? There are times where you know God is like, stop. Don't say it. Maybe it's just me. Don't say it, or I'm going to say it. Go ahead, say it. Won't be good. I want to do it. Go ahead, do it. Do it. You'll regret it. Not sometimes, not most times. Every single time. By his Spirit and by his word, God restrains us, right? And God puts you in positions sometimes where you realize this is God telling me don't do it. You ever about to make a mistake and somehow God intervenes, the phone's going off or someone arrives, and that's your chance to get out. And we're stupid enough to still be like, oh, I think this is a good idea. Listen to this. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. I'm already mad. If she's cooking and she's making, it's coming to me. Now I got to, get it, right? She could do that home for us, and now she's having to do it for who? It's all up. When my daughter is baking cakes and I'm not getting any of it, we got a problem. She's got to make perfumes for him. Like, if you can't serve God, if you don't love God, what do you think you're going to do with a human king? Like, if you don't like the way God treated you, what do you think Saul's going to do? And look at what they say. He'll take away, here he is. He'll take away, and by the way, do you understand that if he's now saying he will take away the best of your fields, do you realize what they had when God was king? The best of the fields. When God was king, I had a field. Where's that go? I had to give it to Saul. Look at what it says. He will take, he won't say, hey, I just want a field. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own officials. Sweet. Now, here we go again. How do you tell the truth to your kid? Why does so-and-so have our olive grove? Why did we give him over there our best field? What happened, Daddy? What's the truth to that statement? We rejected. How many parents you think fessed up to that? Here's what do you think people would do? Well, we just got to be no king. This is a problem, right? This is what I'm telling you. If that's us, how many of us standing up and telling our kids and our grandkids, we messed up, we rejected God, we were crazy? No, we make it like, oh, Saul's a horrible person. God is telling them what they're going to have. The best of your fields. He'll take it, and look at what it says. In your olive groves, and give them to his own officials. We're still having the same argument today about government intervention and interference and how much government should do. Well, it was fine without a government when God was the president, and guess what? Can you imagine every time an official was crazy? We didn't have this before. Verse 15, he'll take a tenth of your grain and your grape harvest and distribute it among his officers and attendants. Doesn't seem this is a one-sided deal, ain't it? Like, what are the people? Imagine standing on this platform. Imagine a president stands up and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take your sons and I'm going to conscript them. I'm going to take your daughters, take them from your house, make them serve me. I'm going to take all your good stuff and give it to my officials. Who wants in? Run on that platform and see how many votes you get. Your own kids wouldn't vote for you. And yet God is telling them up front. This is exact. And by the way, if it's a politician telling you, you might say, they don't know what they're talking about. When God predicts something, guess what's going to happen? Can you imagine going home and thinking, this is a great idea? And look at what it says. He'll take, verse 16. Verse 15, he'll take a tenth of your grain, your grape harvest, and distribute it among his officers and attendants. Verse 16, he will take your male and female slaves and demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. So your slaves are gone, your cattle's gone, your donkey's gone, and it's all to use for the who? For the king. And by the way, when Saul asks, I want your donkey, guess whose side God is on? Mm-hmm. So when you try and fight to get the donkey, God's already, no. I already told you. You see, when they try and if they wanted to ever get their stuff back, their problem is in doing that, they're fighting against who? Yeah, they got themselves in a jam. Look at what it says, verse 17. He'll demand a tenth of your flocks, and you will be his what? So let's be clear. Let's be clear about this even in modern day. You can run from God. You can disobey God. You can be lost as a goose. Everybody is a slave in some manner or form. Do you understand that they didn't run away from slavery? They just changed their slavery from serving and being under God to being under Saul. Lost people are all slaves of who? Of the devil. Now, we come to Christ and we're slaves, but we have a perfect master and we're no longer, sin and death have lost control over us. So being a slave under Jesus is the best slavery you can ever hear of. It's a perfect master. And I know there's connotations and we don't like the word slave, but that's what we are. We're total bond slaves. We're bond servants. Before I was a slave to the devil. Now I'm a slave to God, but I've always been a slave. Israel isn't getting out of slavery. It's putting themselves under worse bondage. Think about how we do that today as Christians. We keep going down the wrong path. God's telling us, you shouldn't be doing this. Oh, I'm going to do it. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. We think that we have to do something or say something to get, to be free. And what we don't realize is that when you're doing the wrong thing, you become more bound than you ever were before. We see sometimes obedience as like bondage. Like, man, that's too bound. Like, that's too much time. That's too much effort. I don't want to be bound like that. Well, here's the problem. If you walk away from it, you'll be more bound than you were following. We can't get out of serving somebody. We're always serving somebody. We're serving ourselves. We're serving the flesh. We're serving God. We're always serving somebody. And look at what God tells them. He says, he will take your male and female slaves to demand your cattle, your flocks, and you, look at how cleanly he says it. You will be his what? What did they cry out of Egypt for? What did they not like about Egypt? Oh, they hated being slaves. Okay, so take your pick, under Pharaoh or under Saul. They for 400 years they were in bondage. They get out and all they can do is think, what? We get saved, we get out of bondage, bitterness, brokenness, lying, cheating, stealing, all of that. And as soon as, and then we get bad circumstances and we want to run back. Why would we ever go back to the way we were? Do you realize, at the cross, do you realize how much you wanted to rid yourself of slavery? And yet sometimes we buy right back into it. And we go back to our old self. We go back to our own way of doing things. And he point blank tells them, you will be his slaves. And listen to this. If this doesn't bring the fear of God on you, nothing will. You imagine listening to this as Israel. When that day comes, in other words, guess what? It is coming. He doesn't tell them when. When that day comes, what does he say? You will beg for relief from this king. There is going to come a moment and come a day where you want to get out of Saul. You don't want Saul anymore. You are going to beg for relief. And then look at what it says. But then, what? The Lord won't help you. You imagine being told that. You know how ignorant and crazy that is? You're going to reject this. You're going to regret this choice. And when you beg for Saul to get out, there's going to come a day. And God's gracious and merciful, we'll see that. But he's obviously talking about specific moments. He's going to say what? I'm not helping you. Now, where's Israel when that happens? What do you want to read in verse 19? Somebody stood up. Now, Samuel isn't to stand up because Samuel's been said what? Do whatever they tell you. Where is somebody, anybody? Give me a 6-year-old. Give me somebody that says, did you listen to that? I mean, imagine at the business meeting, everyone's like, oh, we want a king. Are you nuts? Did you not hear what we just said? And Samuel is there telling them exactly. And he's proven himself as a prophet. They can't go home and say, oh, Samuel. No. And in the end, he'll say to them, tell me what I stole. Tell me how I cheated you. And they can't think of anything. So they can't go home and say, well, Samuel's just a liar. No. But the people refused to listen to whose warning? It says Samuel's, but it's really whose? And look at what they say. Even so. It's almost like they don't even argue that that's going to happen. We don't care if that happens, whether it happens or not. Who cares? Even so, we want what? You might say that's outrageous, that's heinous, but I'm telling you, we fight that same battle in our Christian walk. I'm going to make this call, God. And God, even by the Spirit, through ministry, through the Word, through whatever tells you, don't do it. Don't do it. And you know that it's a wrong thing to do. And what do? We do it anyway. See, it's easy to look tonight and go mental at the Israelites. And clearly there's not a whole lot going on that's like worthy of much praise at this point. But I do think you have to be rational a bit and step back and think, they're not the only ones that do that. Like the Bible's pretty clear about stuff that we take for granted. Don't lie. Don't gossip. Don't, whatever you want to make it. And we think, I'll just do it. It'll be a good idea. And the telltale sign that you're off with God is the state of your inner man. Like how much joy do you think was in Israel at this moment? How much peace? When you looked at Israel, how much of God were you seeing in Israel? How happy were they? And they refused to listen to Samuel's warning. Even so, we still want a king. And here's that utterance again. Here's that same messed up mindset. We want to be like the nations around us. Oh, like the Philistines, where Dagon just falls over? I mean, what part of the other nations do you want? You want to be like Egypt? That worked out real well for Egypt. What other nation do they want to be like? What other nation do they say they don't have God and that's what we want to be? I mean, what nation are they looking at that says they have it better? What history do they have to say, I'd rather be an Egyptian than an Israelite? God has just single-handedly beaten all the what? All the Philistines. So at this point, if you're like, hey, can we be directed like the Philistines? Like, what? And they look around and they're like, nah, God, you're not working for us. We want to be like every other nation. That is the ammo of the devil. The devil wants us to think of marriage the same as the world does. The devil wants us to think of abortion the same way the world does. The devil wants us to see cheating and lying and adultery and sex and all kinds of stuff the same way as the world does. And it's rife. It's rife. It's rife in our culture. And if you don't want any flack, then the moment you stand up for Christian, and by the way, these aren't new Christian principles. These aren't things that someone just made up and is radical and new and no one's heard of them before. The Bible hasn't changed. The same truth that was accepted 100 years ago is now being what? Is now being challenged. Because Israel may see God as, man, he demands a lot. We have to serve him, we have to honor him, we have to do all these festivals, we have to do all this stuff. And they don't realize the bondage they're about to bring on themselves. And look at what it says. We want to be like the nations around our king, like there's something to be proud of. Our king will judge us. All right, I get why some of them, like I said, I get why some of them want that because, frankly, I'd rather have Saul judge me than God in some ways. And look at what they say. And God's got a great sense of humor. God's over everything. What is their big thing about Saul? He will lead us into what? Can he make Dagon fall over? Can he produce tumors? Can he bring manna from heaven? Seems like pretty bad choice. It's not like God, Saul. Like, on a good day, Saul might. What you got, Saul? And yet, God is going to take charge. And God is going to do what he needs to do. God doesn't say, hey, pick your own king and I'm stepping out. He could have. But he doesn't. And we'll read in the story and I'll talk about it when we get there. But this cracks me up every time. They've just said, we want a king because he will lead us into what? He will lead us into battle. Awesome. That sounds like a really, really good idea, right? Apart from, look at, I've talked about this, but look at chapter 10 a minute. We'll talk about this later. I just want to make a point. That is their big stick, right? We want a king who will lead us into battle. And don't think God's hand's not over this. Look at verse 20 of chapter 10. So Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel before the Lord, and the tribe of Benjamin was chosen by lot. And that was luck, right? No, that's providence. Then he brought each family of the tribe of Benjamin before the Lord, and the family of the Matrites was chosen. And finally, the son of Kish, Saul, was chosen from among them. We'll find out why was he chosen. Because he was handsome and he was tall. That's what you want. Because in a battle against the Philistines, that's really going to matter. And look at where do you find him? You don't think God's got a sense of humor? When they looked for him, he had disappeared. You imagine the scene. You imagine coronating a queen or what they call it with the president, inauguration day. Where's he at? Oh, he's afraid. What? I mean, have you ever seen that? Would that give you like the warm fuzzies? This is exactly what happens. God says, Saul's it. Where's Saul? You can't mess with God. Look at what he says. They couldn't find him. He disappeared. Who did they you imagine how embarrassing this is? Who did they have to ask? We just rejected you as king. We don't need you. We don't need your help. We don't need your wisdom. We don't need you. We can do that at times, right? We can say, God, I'll take this. But eventually you're going to come asking what? For help. So they had to ask. Who did they ask? They had to ask the Lord. And what did he say? They asked him what? Where's Saul? Where's he at? I wish I was next to the Lord when he said stuff like this. And the Lord replied, he's hiding among the what? You get that, right? You get that God's over all of this? The king God has a sense of humor. This is an accident. Where's our king, God? Old boy's hiding. He's scared to death. I'm not being funny. Imagine, all right, so you call me here, I'm your pastor. Where's he at? Oh, he won't come out and preach. He's behind that curtain. How many would be like, can we take a revote? I mean, just imagine that. Day one. Where's he at? Oh, it's too much for him. He's behind the curtain. Is he coming out? I don't know. I mean, imagine being on the search committee, Sarah and that, and how would you answer that? I didn't know he was going to hide behind the curtain. It's ridiculous. And God has put them where they, imagine that, Lord, how embarrassed should they have been? Where's that king we want? He's too scared to come out. I'll finish a bit early and we'll pray, but let me look at chapter 9 a minute and just see. And it's comforting to us in a way, no matter how much we mess it up, no matter how much we go the wrong way, no matter, God still rules and reigns. Like God didn't just leave Israel to Israel's own devices. You know who picked Saul? God does. They didn't get that. They think they do. And the way we talked about the other night, God moving cows to a certain place, to a certain stone. I don't think we realize the power that God has, the type of plans he has, or how much he intervenes in what seems like ordinary circumstances. Do you know what nobody said when donkeys went missing? This is how God's going to claim a king. Nobody had any clue. God, I'm telling you, God told donkeys to go, they hid somewhere. I'm telling you, God made a donkey donkeys go where they shouldn't go and hide for the amount of days he needed them to hide. If you don't believe that, what you're left is, well, that was hugely lucky. Do you see tonight what I'm trying to tell you is, do you believe that? Do you believe that God is so involved in life and so powerful and so like planning and so into what he's doing that he can make your donkey move 100%? Maybe what's happening in your life isn't coincidence after all. Maybe God uses a mundane, ordinary thing to get people involved in something they have no idea. Listen, if Saul's scared, how about if God says, you're the next king, it's done? He doesn't. He sets this whole scenario up. And Samuel, he's helping Samuel by do all this because Samuel is going to be spoken to by God, and he knows, what's the one thing Samuel wants to know? Samuel has to know who to anoint. He has to. And so God just tells him point blank, it's. And by the way, when he says it's him, Samuel must have thought, okay, do everything he tells me to do. Because the only thing that Saul was known for was being taller and better looking. That might get you things in life, but it's not a great thing for your president. What have you got? I'm tall and good looking. Awesome. Fantastic. And he clearly was. He was tall and good looking. It's what it says. He wasn't like, he was. It's kind of weird how humanity's never changed, right? You mean Israel was caught up in the natural and the outward appearance? 100%. They didn't interview him and say, where you at? God just took care of it. Look at what it says. There was a wealthy influence. Oh, here we go. He's also a good king because his dad is what? Oh, you know. How crazy is that? His dad is wealthy and influential, and yet he's about to inherit what? All of the stuff that God just gave him. It's like the rich just keep getting what? Like Saul wasn't hurting for stuff. There was a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the son of Abiel, son of Zerorah, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah of the tribe of Benjamin. His son Saul. Here we go. Here's your introduction. Oh, God, what are you going to say about me? I mean, honestly, if God could say one sentence about you, what would you want him to say? Do you see how, like, kind of fruitless and pointless it is? Well, you're very good looking. Oh, thank you. Is that really what you want? I mean, if God was to give you a one-sentence testimony, is that really what you want? I mean, our flesh would be like, oh, I knew I was the most handsome person in here. But exactly what does that get you? Like, whoever's the tallest in here, congrats. But what does that really get you? What God says, look at what the Bible says. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. So you can see that their natural tendency was like, ooh. Don't do it. Don't look at the... Remember what God's going to tell him when he anoints David? Man looks on the outside. David's different. He looks small. He looks like nothing, but he's got something inside that they don't have. Right. And then he says this. One day, here it is again. I can't stress this enough. The Bible kind of just says one day. But God, in just the right time, at just the right way, intervenes. If God knows about a donkey, and God can move a donkey, then whatever he has to remove in your life, whatever he has to move around in your life, whatever he has to do to get you to where he wants you to get, guess what he can do? You get it, right? You get how significant this is? You might just pass it over and like, oh, who cares, a donkey went missing. God's setting up the whole situation. God is setting up the whole situation. And if we believe that tonight, if we believe God was ordaining that a donkey moves, then what are we worried about? Oh, he'll never work in my boss. He can. Donkey straight away. And so the dad says to Saul, God knows that Saul needs someone with him. The servant's going to play a pivotal role. So you know what he says? He makes the dad say what? Go look for the donkeys and take a servant with you. It's kind of crazy. So Saul's already been used to having servants and all of this stuff. And look at what it says. Take a servant and go. I'll finish here next week. If I start on this, look at what it says. If you ask Saul, what is your mission? What would he tell you? What would he tell you his mission was? If you said to him, what is your life about right now? What is your assignment? What is your job? What is it that you have to do? What is his job? Find the donkeys. Is that his job? Is that at all what's really happening? Does God care at all about a donkey? He's going to, you know what? Without Saul being there, the donkeys somehow are going to what? End up right back where they started. I find it funny. I was thinking about this today. Like, where were the donkeys the whole time? Probably right behind a bush or something. But you realize, not to be found, they can't make a noise, they can't be visible. God is not only making the donkeys move, he's put the donkeys somewhere that nobody can get to. What I'm getting at is this. Maybe you don't know what your mission is. Maybe you have no idea how God is using you. Maybe you think you've just become this or that. You've lost your job. You've become a widow. You've inherited money. Your situation has changed somehow. And you think, how many of us really know the mission of God in our lives tonight? Saul thought, I'm just chasing donkeys. You're about to be king. You're about to be king. Maybe God has us on a mission as a church that no one has a clue what he's doing. But we're going to look back and say, Huh. That wasn't about the donkeys at all. And by the way, what a lesson for Saul. How did you become king? Well, funny story, that. God showed him his sovereignty, his power, his providence, everything through a donkey. A simple, you think this is long, I did 12 weeks on this in Texas, like just on this bit, like just on Saul. I'll give you the tape if you don't believe me. I'm sure I'll get many requests. All right. But look, sometimes we think, well, what am I doing? Or why nothing's working? Or I'm not contributing anything. Well, hold on. God might have you just where he wanted you. God might have put the person right beside, just a servant. Who are you? And it turns out that whoever the servant was does things and says things and has things that exactly Samuel needed. Not Samuel, Saul. Is that coincidence? I'm glad. You know what Saul didn't think? I really need your spiritual help in this journey. I need you to have one piece left of the money. I need you to guide me. I need you to be with me. I need you to, because it's a servant that makes Saul realize that Samuel's around. The servant is really, really important. Maybe God allowed you to marry who you married for bigger reasons than you've ever thought. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts? We'll continue that next week. I want to pray, though. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions before we pray, and then we'll